budget looming, April 2, we thought it's time to look at the kinds of things that could happen in the budget that might have an impact on the economy, ultimately company profits and even share prices. Paul, let's kick off with economic forecast because that's always underpinning any budget, isn't it?
Yeah, it's important, Peter, that these come out of Treasury, not the government. And whatever Treasury is saying now in April, doesn't matter who wins the election, you can guess that the winning party will look at the same sort of forecast and they'll set the parameter for what either party can actually spend. Look, we've got on the screen to view some forecasts from Deloitte who provided these. The big one here is the so-called GDP, or what the rate of growth in the economy. Now last year the government was very confident forecasting 3% growth, so was the Reserve Bank. People have trimmed that forecast for the current year to about 2.2%. Be really interesting to see what they actually say for next year. I suspect it's going to be under 3%, Peter.
Yes,
and that's sort of perhaps as a need for a budget that maybe a little more stimulation in terms of spending.
Yep.
On things like employment growth, that looks reasonably okay. The unemployment rate, most people expect that to stay under 5%. The other one there to call out is just the increase in average weekly earnings, still on the light side. So, and that has an impact, particularly on revenues for the government. So, I think the forecast side, look, they'll set the framework for both parties. And as I said, they're coming from Treasury, not the government. Yep. So that's really gives you a clue in terms of what the bureaucrats in Canberra think is going to happen with our economy.
Yeah, and an important number there also, I think, Paul, is the fact that unemployment is still heading down. And that's a good thing for lots of companies that are in that consumer space.
Well, it really means Treasury doesn't believe that the economy is going to fall in a hole. It needs a little bit of stimulation, but we're not going to see a lot of pressure in the employment market from and have people on the street looking for government handouts.
Yeah. Okay, let's go to the budget outcomes, the surplus or the deficit. What can we expect?
Well, on the screen in front of you, you can see projections for the next couple of years, but we start with actually what the projection was last year. At the same time when the government delivered its budget, they were forecasting in that first column a deficit for the current year of $14.5 billion.
Yeah, pretty big.
When they did the so-called MyEFO review in December, that's a mid-year review of the forecast, that had been cut down to just $5.2 billion. Now Deloitte says that as a starting point, this current financial year, the budget deficit will only be about $2.1 billion. Now that's really on the back of a lot higher company tax collections, largely because our resources companies, we know BHP and Rios and the Fortescues and others have been doing a lot better on the back of high iron ore prices, therefore they're paying more in company tax profits.
Yep.
Also because employment growth has remained reasonably strong, and so there's fewer people getting access to unemployment benefits, but also paying more personal income tax.
Yeah.
And the government's been able to also maintain reasonably good control over spending. So,
and I guess there's bracket creep in there.
And there's a bit of bracket creep. So just a deficit of $2.1 billion. And as a starting point for 1920, Deloitte says a surplus of $9.8 billion. And then you can see that in 2021 up to over $15 billion. So it starts, on paper at least, with a pretty good position in terms of being able to offer a few handouts in the budget.
Politicians before an election were saying, you little beauty. Okay, so what are you expecting to see in the budget?
Okay, so it's a pre-election budget. I think we're going to see some tax cuts. We know they should be starting with a reasonable surplus for 1920. You expect these to be to start, I think, from the 1st of July, Peter. Otherwise, they're just in the never. And look, targeting low and middle income earners, and I think the issue for these really tax cuts, Peter, is whether they're just one-offs or they're more structural. But the government looks like it's in a reasonable position to offer something. Yeah. I won't say as a pre-election bribe, but at least to get the debate back towards economic policy in the lead up to the election.
Yeah, and a tax cut is a logical thing to think about when an economy that was expected to be growing at 3 or even higher than 3% has dropped down to 2.2%. Let's go to housing, Paul, because that's an important part of growth for the economy.
It is an important part of growth. It's also a part of the political agenda because we know the ALP has a policy about negative gearing. So look, I wouldn't be surprised to see something that helps home buyers, at least not necessarily first home buyers, but people looking for their home to get back into the market. I think there are a couple of reasons. One, as I said, because of the ALP's policy about negative gearing, keeps them focused on that, but also to stimulate the economy. The construction sector perhaps needs a little bit of a boost. And we know from all the focus groups that people still think the cost of housing is very high. So it's an issue out there in the community.
Yeah. And also both Labor and the Coalition wouldn't want this house price fall to get out of hand. And so putting something in there to actually create a bit of a bottom in the fall in house prices makes a lot of sense. Let's go to private health insurance. I know you often look at that.
Yeah, look, I put a question mark up there because it does come up as a huge issue in terms of cost of living pressures. And look, again, this has become very, very political with very different views across the political spectrum about whether the government should be involved in private health insurance. But because the focus groups say it is a big issue, I wouldn't rule out some sort of measure to try to help people out with the cost of private health insurance.
Okay. Now, superannuation changes, they often are thrown into a budget to make a bit of money. What do you think is going to happen this year?
I think very unlikely we'll get any major changes to super. Now, we've said that every year for the last so many years,
Yeah, that's true.
and still there's a plethora of changes that come out. Sometimes they're quite minor, but I think this time, perhaps no changes to superannuation.
Okay. So let's just have a look at the budget in total, then, Paul.
Yeah, look, it's a pre-election budget. We know they start with a fairly healthy position on paper, according to the Deloitte numbers, surplus of around about $9.8 billion before any new spending or tax cuts. So look, I think it's we're not going to see any nasties, Peter. This is we're not going to see a lot of spending cuts. We're not going to see a lot of new fees. Definitely see some stimulation in terms of some tax cuts and maybe some targeted other measures.
Yeah, and I just think that generally I'm very hesitant to support a government throwing away tax cuts before an election. But given the fact that the Oz economy has slowed down faster than most of us expected, I think it's probably the right time for tax cuts, and so this budget will probably deliver the right thing at the right time. And I also think, Paul, that there's probably a good reason for the government to target some spending at particular groups that will actually be good for social welfare reasons, but also to help the economy as well.